record this because I know that there are some people here who are not going to be able to make it, and I'm actually going to be recording for the next couple of days. Yeah, let me just make sure the mic works. Do. I'll take it. Okay, there it is. Okay. Okay, I don't need to hear myself anymore. It's bugging me. Okay, so just to give you a couple of quick announcements, don't forget that I believe you had a quiz and that's due at 5 o'clock. So make sure that you get that done. And we don't actually have any assignments for a little while. Now, just to kind of put it on your radar, we have an exam in a little more than 2 weeks. It'll be on the 17th on a Wednesday. So it's going to cover everyday memory. It's going to probably cover problem solving, and if we have time, judgment and decision making. So everything that we're talking about right now, everything that we talked about with semantic memory, and if we have time, problem solving will be there as well. All right, let's go ahead and continue our discussion of everyday memory. So the last time we were here, we were talking about Martin Conway's work on, Martin Conway's model of the self-memory system. So just to give you a reminder of kind of what we covered here, and this idea that our goals, our working self goals, the things that are important to us influence what we remember. And that means that a lot of our own personal memories from our life are going to be these personal experiences of success or failure. Did we meet the goal or did we fail to meet the goal? As I mentioned last time, consistency. So making sure that we have a coherent sense of self and our memories line up with that is important. Accuracy is as well, but if the two are ever pitted against each other, what is far more important is that you have that coherence, that consistency. So your sense of self basically stays the same, despite the fact that it may not be an accurate representation of what actually happened. And I did mention, and the last slide we left off with last time was that depression can actually change how we store our autobiographical memories. What we often tend to find is that for people who struggle with depression, autobiographical memories tend to be a little less detailed. And there are a couple of different reasons for this. First of all, it could be an avoidance strategy. So the idea is, remember that most of our memories are records of our success or they're records of failure. And people who are struggling with depression are incredibly sensitive to those potential failures. And so you might end up avoiding retrieval of these memories because of the negative emotions they bring up. But remember that the more that you don't retrieve, the less detailed the memories are. Remember that retrieval gives us an opportunity to embellish our memories, even if it's not necessarily accurate. So less retrieval means less detail overall. Eyewitness testimony. This is the one that everybody likes. Is anybody here also taking criminology classes? I know we have quite a few people who are thinking about double majoring in criminology and psychology, or majoring in criminology and minoring in psychology. And so this is going to be pretty relevant. And in general, I think you're going to find this probably one of the more interesting sections of memory. And also, this is really one of the few times that memory gets controversial. So I find it kind of interesting. Like, we don't get into slap fights about whether or not short-term memory is either 1 item or 4 items. Like, we don't get into those kind of slap fights, but here, this is actually pretty contentious stuff because we're implying that the things that we remember are not always accurate. So this is a case where memory accuracy absolutely matters. You absolutely want to be accurate for the details of a crime if you want to appropriately convict. Now, how much should we actually rely on eyewitness memory and eyewitness testimony for a crime? Simons and Chabris actually found that back in 2011, so Simons and Chabris, by the way, were the ones who did inattentional blindness with the invisible gorilla. You might remember we watched that moonwalking bear. They're the same folks. They basically found that 37% of people that were polled believed that the testimony of just one eyewitness should be sufficient for conviction. Additionally, judges, about 60% believe that eyewitness testimony is always valid and is a reliable source of evidence. 87% of jurors believe that as well. And that's why I never get put on juries. I actually got called into jury duty. I mentioned that I was a psychologist and they were like, nope. Because I know that eyewitness memories are not always valid. Although, please don't go to jury duty and try to get out of it. It's an important thing to do if they ever ask you. So judges typically disagree with eyewitness experts about 60% of the time. Jurors disagree with experts about 87% of the time. So that's what that 60% and that 87% mean. So experts typically believe that eyewitness testimony can be useful, but it shouldn't necessarily be taken as a sole source of evidence. And a good bunch of jurors will disagree with that. Okay, now for those who watched the video that I showed right at the beginning of the lecture, I have 3 questions for you, and I want you to answer them in your notes and we'll talk about them really quick, okay? All right, so what weapon did the hijacker use for the crime? So go ahead and write down your memory of the weapon. What color were the hijacker's shoes? And then finally, what color were the hijacker's eyes? Okay, so let's answer those together. So what weapon did the hijacker use? Sawed-off shotgun, good job. What color were his shoes? They were kind of white. They were kind of off-white, dirty white Converses or something. Huh? They were brown and white? Okay. Okay. What color were his eyes? That's a good catch. Now, sometimes when you ask people a leading question like that, they will actually answer with an eye color. So occasionally I've done this with the intro psych students. And if you wait long enough, like part of it is if I waited until the end of class, you might have said differently. But the idea is that with a leading question, I'm basically giving you new information and you're going to try to integrate that into your memory. So this comes into play when we talk about something called post-event misinformation, which we're going to talk about with a lot of other factors that also influence eyewitness testimony. So we're going to talk a little bit about confirmation bias, and we are going to go back to talking very briefly about schemas. As I mentioned, misinformation like leading questions or stories that you read the day before can often misinform and distort your memory for an event. The presence of a weapon in a crime can actually affect your memory performance, and then aging can as well. So we're going to talk about each of these in greater detail. All right, everybody good? Okay. So our expectations influence what we want to witness. So there's a very well-known there's a very well-known phenomenon that pops up in judgment and decision making that is called confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is basically when you look for information that confirms your point of view and you discount anything that doesn't. So basically, your memory for an event is influenced by who you expect to commit a crime. You have an idea of what a criminal looks like, and as a result, it is going to influence what you remember about the event and what you don't remember about the event. Oftentimes, what we're going to find is that what we remember are the things that fall in line with what we expect. And we discount anything that does not fit with that, or will distort anything that doesn't fit with that. So for example, what sort of things, what does a criminal look like? And of course, the answer is a criminal can look like anybody, but that's not necessarily the case. Even though technically, yes, a criminal can look like anybody, but what we find is that things like police reporting and news stories will often influence who we believe to be a criminal and who we believe is not a criminal. So this is a study by Lindholm and Christensen in 1998. And as you know, a lot of countries in Europe are dealing with increased amounts of immigration from people in other countries. And Sweden in particular is a pretty homogenous culture. So having these immigrants come in is for a lot of people who are used to this homogenous culture, it may be very unsettling to them and surprising and unexpected. So both Swedish and immigrant students saw a simulated robbery. So the criminal actually wounded a cashier with a knife, and then they were shown different color photographs of the criminals. They were shown 8 men. So there were 4 people that clearly looked Swedish, and there were 4 people that clearly looked like immigrants. And what they ended up finding was that both the Swedish and the immigrant participants were 2 times as likely to select an innocent immigrant than an innocent Swede from the lineup. So they were more likely to believe that the immigrant was the criminal than somebody who was actually a Swede. And so very much what we see in Sweden is that oftentimes immigrants are often overrepresented in their crime statistics, and that gets reported pretty regularly. So when people think of a crime being committed, they aren't necessarily thinking of somebody who is Swedish, they are thinking of an immigrant. Here in the United States, we have very similar things related to race. Certain races tend to be overrepresented in our crime statistics, which has led many people to actually end up excluding race from police reports. So schemas can also influence us as well. So I want to go back to Bartlett's 1932 work on the War of the Ghosts, which I read to you. Now, as we read in that story, it's pretty vague. The narrative is very, very different from our own. And Bartlett actually found that for those vague components, such as when the black stuff came out of the young man's mouth, a lot of people will reframe that so that it's blood or perhaps a monster of some kind. And so people changed the story and changed the narrative to basically fit the understanding of narratives in their culture. And in case you haven't taken the quiz yet, Bartlett had a name for this. You can actually read about it more in previous chapters, but Bartlett called this, and I probably should not put this in blue, there we go. Bartlett called this rationalization. So we're basically trying to distort our understanding of the story to basically fit how our narratives work. So for example, many of you changed the young men to boys because oftentimes many of our folk tales and fairy tales in our culture are typically not necessarily always about adults, but about children. But the thing is, we have schemas for everything. We have schemas for a crime. So for example, can somebody give me a basic schema for a bank robbery? Give me a schema for a bank robbery. Somebody tell me what happens when a bank gets robbed.
Somebody with like a mask on their face, like a black mask, that come in with like a gun.
Okay, somebody with a mask comes in with a gun, okay, or some kind of weapon, usually a gun. And then what else?
They also have like a bag of some sort to store whatever they're looking for.
Okay, they have a bag. What else happens?
Usually go to the teller and say, give me money.
Okay, or give me the key to your vault, or give me access to your safe deposit boxes. And then usually what happens is the teller presses an emergency button and eventually the police show up. That's the basic idea of a bank robbery. Now, here's another question. Do the bank robbers usually have a gender?
Men.
Generally men, yes. Like, again, a criminal can be anybody, but oftentimes we believe that men are more likely to be criminals. They are overrepresented in crime statistics. So what we find is that much like Bartlett's rationalization, where ambiguous information is modified or distorted to work with our narratives, we can actually also do ambiguous, we modify ambiguous information to actually fit with our schema. So for example, many of you brought up that in a bank robbery, we actually use ways to conceal our faces. And of course, in the age of COVID, that's actually pretty interesting. But let's imagine it as in this study by Tuckey and Brewer, that somebody's face is completely concealed with a balaclava. Now, does anybody not know what a balaclava is? Okay, I will go ahead and show you a picture. A couple of years ago, I actually had a student, when I was presenting this part, just looked at me for a second and said, oh, the rationalization is still there. One of my students looked at me and they said, why would they need to cover their face with a baklava? And I'm like, no, this is not a baklava, which is a delicious pastry. This is a balaclava, which is basically designed to kind of work like this. So the only thing that you see are the eyes with a balaclava. So let me see. So here in this instance, so you see this person wearing this balaclava. Now, if we concealed this, now imagine, I know that you can tell that that is a face of a male presenting person, obviously, but under normal circumstances, when you're looking at a police videotape, you're not going to have as good detail on this. So when you're looking at somebody on a police tape with a balaclava, you're not going to be able to identify their gender. And yet, when people report the details of the crime, they often will identify the culprit as male, even if they do not have that information available or that information is ambiguous. So we basically take our understanding of what a bank robbery is and who a criminal is, and we fill in the missing information. And unfortunately, most of the time it's correct, but there are some times it could be wrong too. The reason it's usually correct is because certain groups are overrepresented in our crime statistics. So now I want to talk a little bit about that post-event misinformation. I asked you a leading question about our criminal that you did not have. His eyes were covered with sunglasses, and I asked you what color were his eyes, and you thankfully did not fall for it. But sometimes people do, because when you ask them what color were his eyes, I am basically sending you the implicit assumption you must have seen them, or else I wouldn't be asking, because Dr. Gilchrist would never trick you. Never, ever. I only trick you for purposes of demonstrations. I don't trick you any other time. But we have to talk a little bit about post-event misinformation. So leading questions, leading questions in interviews can influence how we remember information about crimes. And so we have to talk about the famous work of Elizabeth Loftus, as well as Palmer back in 1974, where eyewitness memories were actually distorted by post-event misinformation. So Loftus and Palmer believe that it's not just what happens at the crime that matters, it's what happens after the crime that also influences how you remember it. So in this case, participants were shown a film of a car accident, and then they were asked to describe what happened, and then they were asked some questions. And one of the things that they found was that one of the tricky, kind of cool things that Loftus and Palmer did here was they asked people different questions. I was worried I had no chalk. I've got the tiniest of nubbins. Okay, thank you. It's like, I don't know if I can write with this. My knuckles are gonna get right into the chalkboard. Thank you. Okay. So Loftus and Palmer asked them a couple of questions about the crime. Now, I want to make very clear that no matter what condition people were in, they watched the same video. I want to keep that in mind. Everybody watched the same car accident. So some people were asked, how fast were the cars going when they bumped each other? Another group of people got, how fast were the cars going when they hit each other? Another group got, how fast were the cars going when they collided with each other? Another group got, how fast were the cars going when they contacted each other? And then a final group got, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? So here's what's really, really interesting, is that depending on the wording of the questions, they were all asked the same question, how fast were the cars going? They all watched the exact same film where the car is going a constant speed, regardless of condition. However, all of these questions influence how people estimate speed. So for example, generally smashed into was associated with higher driving speed than something like bumped. So the wording of the question actually changed the speed estimate that the participants produced. Moreover, people that got smashed into were more likely to falsely recall that they had seen broken glass in the film when no broken glass had actually been presented. And again, it's all about the wording of the question. Everybody watched the same film, but if you get asked the question smashed into, you're going to assume broken glass is involved. And we do find that your memories can be distorted by these kind of leading questions. Now, nobody falsely thought that there was no car accident. So everybody remembered that there was a car accident for sure. What is interesting, though, is that this misinformation is more for peripheral details, like smaller details of the accident, and not usually for the big things. Nobody's going, I didn't see a car accident. Everybody saw a car accident. The central event is very well remembered, but it's the things around it, the peripheral details, whether the road sign was a stop or a yield sign, whether broken glass was present. All of those things can absolutely be influenced by post-event misinformation. So I will tell you speed estimates, and this is from your book. They actually have the speed estimates if you're curious. The speed estimates were 40.8 miles an hour when it was smashed into. Collided was 39.3, bumped was 38.1, and hit was 34. I actually find that interesting. Bumped feels like it would be slower than hit, because when I think of bumping, I think of bumper cars, and bumper cars don't go all that fast. So there you go. So here's an example. So the wording of the question actually changes recall. So in a control group where they were simply told how fast were the cars going, they give this estimate. Notice that here we have the percentage of people that were claiming broken glass. You can see that compared to controls, you get a little more with hit, but you have an even larger percentage falsely recalling that they saw broken glass when they were given the word smashed into. Words have meaning. So this is about 14%. This is about 32%. So this is basically almost doubling. This graph is not appropriate. Bad graph, bad. Go to the corner. Okay, so we talked a little bit about post-event misinformation, but here's something interesting. You can also have what is called a pre-event misinformation effect as well. So Lindsay and colleagues were basically, they heard a story the day before. So Lindsay and colleagues basically gave participants a story to listen to. They were either told about a palace burglary, or they were told a story about a field trip that a bunch of children took to a palace. And what's really interesting is that those who heard the story about the palace burglary, the next day, they had to watch a video of a museum burglary. And what's really interesting is that whatever story they got the day before actually influenced their recall of the event of the museum burglary. So if they heard a story about a palace burglary, what's really interesting is that many of their details of the museum burglary actually lined up with what they had heard about the story of the palace burglary the day before. Oh, sorry. See, y'all, I'm such a dork. I'm going to share something kind of funny. You should go to the next Cotty band concert in December. We're playing Toto's Africa, and I'm so excited. That is the best song ever from one of the best years ever. And I'm not, oh, that's the best song ever from one of the best years ever. And I'm not just saying that because I was born that year. Actually, I kind of am. Okay. So why do we get this post-event misinformation? Why does this happen when we get pre-event misinformation? Whoa, you almost made me jump off my stool. So one of the reasons that this happens is a pretty well-known phenomenon known as misattribution of source, or source misattribution. So how many of you have heard this happen where an artist comes out with a song, and then it turns out somebody says to them, you know, this song sounds like another song, you should probably give them credit. So for example, Taylor Swift's Look What You Made Me Do sounds like Right Said Fred's I'm Too Sexy. They kind of sound similar. Now that might not have been intentional, but sometimes it happens where we have a song in our head and we think it's coming from us, but it's because we listened to a similar song the day before. It's why Katy Perry's Roar kind of sounds like Sarah Bareilles' Brave, because because of source misattribution. So one of the reasons that this happens is that with source misattribution, we think we know the source of the memory, but it actually came from somewhere else. So for example, a couple of years ago, my late grandfather was struggling with Alzheimer's disease, and he went to go to the doctor, and he later told my aunt, oh, the doctor never saw me. He basically came in for 5 minutes and talked to me, and then he left. And then it turned out when my aunt went to go talk to the doctor was like, oh no, I was in there for 20 or 30 minutes and he talked and made conversation with me. So what we think happened is he might have had a memory from the past where the doctor hadn't talked to him very much, and he misremembered the recent doctor's visit and remembered the incorrect one in its place. So source misattribution is basically the rememberer is often mistaken about the origin or the source of the memory. So they forget where it actually came from. So that's something that can happen. It happens because of the stories that we've heard or news that we've heard or things that we've heard from other people, and we misattribute the source. The other big thing that is also important is that anytime that you are reactivating a memory trace that has been consolidated into your long-term memory, here's something interesting. So part of the reason that memories are so prone to distortion is because when you've retrieved them for a very short period of time, they're fragile. They're fragile in a way that they normally are not, because you're bringing them back into your conscious awareness. And because of that, that puts them in a temporarily fragile state. Because of that, we can end up having, so when I'm asking you to remember the film of the car accident and I ask you this question, I'm asking you to retrieve it. In that moment, that memory of the film that you watched is very fragile and can be manipulated by the wording of these questions. So anytime that you are reactivating a memory, you are temporarily making it fragile and more prone to distortion as a result. So retrieval is really important, but it also means potential bad news for our long-term memories. So you know what that means? Nobody should remember anything. No, I'm kidding. Don't do that. You do need to remember things to do well on tests. That's kind of important. So let's talk about the effects of anxiety and violence upon your memory for eyewitness events. Okay. So one of the major things that we know is that the presence of a weapon will actually hurt your memory for other details of a crime. This is very famously referred to as weapon focus. So it's almost like if there is a weapon that is present in the crime, as that crime is being committed, your attention is going to lock in on that weapon, and it is going to hurt your memory for anything else. And honestly, y'all, that makes a lot of sense, right? If you're in a crime where there's a weapon, that is a threat to your life. You should be focusing on surviving, not necessarily remembering the details of what every person looks like. So it makes sense on some level that this would be an issue. But this is an instance where Loftus actually presented people with an image. And they either had an image of somebody pointing a gun at a cashier, or they had an image of somebody pointing a check. So the hand motions were almost identical. Obviously, holding a check is going to look a little different than holding a gun, but it's going to be roughly the same hand movement. So almost everything was identical in this scene, except whether it was a gun or whether it was a check. And when they actually measured what people did when they looked at these images, people looked, when a gun was present, they looked more at the gun and they did not remember the other details of that scene. So why does this happen? This happens for a couple of different reasons. And the biggest reasons of all is that weapons are threatening and typically they pop up in unexpected places. So if I go to a gun range and somebody comes up to me with a gun at their side, I'm not going to be like, oh my gosh, it's a gun. I'm at the shooting range. People have guns at a shooting range. So that is not an unexpected environment. That is absolutely expected. But if I go to the grocery store and I see somebody with a gun, that is an unexpected place. So Pickle, and yes, that is their name, Pickle. So Pickle basically had a really interesting study that they did. They actually crossed the threat of a condition and whether the weapon was expected or unexpected. So here's basically what they did. So in an unexpected condition with low threat, the gun was pointed at the ground in a baseball field. So somebody watched a video of this happening. So this is a low threat condition. Generally, you only point at what you want to shoot. So something that is being pointed at the ground, that is typically what you are supposed to do if you're not about to shoot something. You point it at the ground. That way, if it goes off, you're not going to hurt somebody. So this is a low threat situation, but having a gun at a baseball field is pretty unexpected. Now, on the other hand, here's a low threat and expected condition. Again, gun is pointed at the ground, but this time you're at a shooting range. That's where guns live, at the shooting range. On the other hand, if we have a high threat situation, the gun is pointed up at a person. So we have high threat and we have an unexpected situation. And then we can cross that with a high threat but expected situation. So we could have a gun pointed at a woman in the shooting range. So here's what we find. So here on your y-axis, we have the mean description score. Higher scores mean better memory for details. And here we have the level of threat, we have our shooting range, and we have our baseball field. Now here's what's really critical. Threat does not necessarily, the expected condition with the shooting range, notice the description scores are actually pretty similar regardless of level of threat. So in this case, when they're expected in a shooting range, we don't really see too much weapon focus. Here's what's really interesting though. So yes, part of the reason that weapon focus happens is because guns are threatening. But what's more important is that they are unexpected. Look at what happens here. Level of threat doesn't seem to matter as much as the fact that it's unexpected. So notice the difference between shooting range and baseball field for low and shooting range and baseball field for high. The difference is pretty similar, indicating that while weapons, yes, are threatening, it is the fact that they are often in unexpected situations that makes weapon focus happen. It's because they're not expected. Oh, interestingly enough, they did another one. This one's kind of interesting. They did another one with, there's a stronger weapon focus. The weapon focus will be greater when the presence of a weapon is unexpected. As predicted, there was a stronger weapon focus effect when a criminal carrying a folding knife was female because it's more unexpected to see a woman with a knife. Also, as predicted, the weapon focus effect was greater when a criminal with a knitting needle was male rather than female. Nobody's getting hurt with a knitting needle. Have you seen those plastic needles? I also have a lot of metal knitting needles. Nobody's getting hurt from a knitting needle. That's why you can carry knitting needles on planes. At least last I checked. Okay. So in general, stress is often going to impair memory. Now, under certain circumstances, stress can be a memory enhancer. If you've had me for biopsych, you might remember me talking about the fact that emotional events often enhance our memory for those events, sometimes in ways that we don't want. But we do actually find that facial recognition, which would be critical for identifying perpetrators, as well as memory for details, often will be better in low stress conditions. And part of the reason for this is that in general, stress narrows your attention. Stress creates tunnel vision. Like, I don't know about you, how many of you are stressed right now? I'm actually doing okay, but some of you are stressed. Are you mostly focusing on the things that are stressing you out right now? Is it softball that's stressing you out, Casey?
No, actually, softball's pretty much done.
Oh, nice. Congratulations. You'll just wait until spring, and then you get more. But in general, what we tend to find is that anxiety and stress tends to create a sense of tunnel vision. We can only focus on the thing that's stressing us out, and we don't really have the ability or the inclination to focus on anything else. And because of that, when this is applied to a crime, we're only going to focus on central details. So Deffenbacher actually found that when you're doing face recognition, that faces were identified 54% of the time in low anxiety. You don't need to know those percentages, I'm just sharing, versus 42% for high anxiety. So that's about a 10% drop. In general, with detailed recall was about 64% for low stress, about 52% for high stress. And I think this citation is incorrect. I believe this should be 2004. So I apologize. I'll fix it because I don't like it when things are incorrect. There we go. Now I feel better. All is right with the world. I'm not a perfectionist, I promise. No, I totally am. It's okay. Okay. So aging and eyewitness memory. So I have to tell you something. You're going to get older. You're like, no, I'm not. I know. Like if you told me you're going to get older, Dr. Gilchrist, I'd go, no, I'm not. I am never getting old. Old is a state of mind. But you are going to have a brain that ages, and this will potentially have some effect on your ability to give good eyewitness testimony. So older adults in general have a less accurate eyewitness memory. Larry Jacoby and colleagues actually found that older adults are also more prone to misinformation. Facebook was a mistake. Because that's where all the misinformation lives, on Facebook now, among other places. So Jacoby, oops, sorry. Here's something kind of interesting that you may not know though. Older adults actually demonstrate what we call an own age bias. This is basically the finding that they have an easier time identifying criminals if they are their own age. So right now, if I asked you to differentiate between different faces of young people and faces of older people, older adults would have an easier time differentiating faces of older people their own age, compared to people who are younger. So here's what's really interesting. This doesn't just happen with age. So the same would be true for you. You'd have an easier time identifying younger people than you would identifying people who are older than you. And that's because you are exposed to people your own age much, much more than you are exposed to middle-aged people or older adults. But not only does this happen for age, this also happens for race. We have what is called an own race bias. We actually have an easier time discriminating and identifying different members of our own race than we do of other races. And this often will happen because for many of us, we are usually spending most of our time around people who are the same race as us. Due to that greater exposure, this happens. And this doesn't just happen for white people. This happens for Black people. This happens for Asian American people. So this happens with a lot of other groups. We all have an own race bias. Again, how do we fix it? More exposure to people that aren't you. Pretty straightforward. Get more exposed to people who aren't like you. Okay, so we have to talk about face recognition and eyewitness memory. We're going to finish this up probably on Wednesday, and we'll start talking about problem solving, and if we have time, judgment and decision making on Wednesday and Friday. So this is probably some of the most classic things that you'll see in movies or TV shows. You'll have somebody sitting behind some double-sided glass like we have in the psych lab, and they say, we want you to identify the perpetrator. And then you have a bunch of these people come out and somebody's like, that's them, it's them. That's how police lineups work on TV, and odds are pretty good. That's how many of you think it works. It turns out it's a bit more complicated than that. And it turns out that this eyewitness testimony, because we have ideas of how police lineups should work, it also messes with our ability to correctly identify a perpetrator. So Valentine and colleagues found in 2013 that our face recognition for police lineups is terrible. In a study of 314 different police lineups, at least 20% of them originally identified a non-suspect as the perpetrator, somebody who was basically there as a decoy and as an innocent person. Only 40% of these 314 lineups correctly actually identified the suspect. Y'all, that is terrible. That's a terrible track record. But part of this happens because of our difficulty recognizing faces. So we're going to go ahead and stop here. We will finish this up on Wednesday. We'll talk about perspective memory, and then we'll start talking about problem solving, and our journey into the world of memory will be over. I hope it's been as much fun for you as it has been for me. But have a wonderful day. I will see you all here on Wednesday. Bye, everybody.